Okay. Oh, my microphone's not on. How loud is that? Does that make any difference? Okay. All right, perfect. Hello. Just grab the door there, and then we will get started. Love the corpses of old dead chairs the U of A just leaves lying around. All right, so welcome to the spring session of SOC 377. So this is Sociology of Youth. Okay, I'll explain this in a sec, but I'll introduce myself first. So yeah, I'm the instructor for the course, Dr. Jeff Broussard. I'm an associate teaching professor here in the Department of Sociology. So, I mean, I don't have the doctor here, and you don't have to call me Dr. Broussard unless you really want to. I don't really care. I'm trying to remember. I started teaching this particular course in 2015. And except for one spring session during COVID, I am the only person in the department who's taught this course, basically in 11 years. So that is, I don't know, perhaps a somewhat dubious distinction. This course is something of my baby at this point. And I think just teaching this class represents the longest single thing I've ever done, aside from raising my kids. But aside from that, the longest job I ever held is teaching this class. And it used to be offered once a year, and now it is offered 3 times a year. So that is super fun. Okay, so we're in the spring, and obviously people's schedules are pretty chaotic. I don't have set office hours, but I am around basically all day on the days that we have class, right? So I'll usually get here around 9 a.m. And I'll be up in my office. Usually now I'm hiding up on the 4th floor in Torrey 424. And if for whatever reason you have a question you want to ask, you can just come knock on my door. You don't have to have an appointment. If you want to book an appointment, say you want to do, usually after one of the exams, you want to meet with me, I have on Canvas, and maybe I'll just show you very quickly, I have an appointment booking link, right? So you just click on that, and it takes you to, Google Calendar, assuming the Wi-Fi here ever works. And I've got a bunch of times kind of blocked off that you can book. And you can say either you want an in-person or an online appointment. I'll probably cut down on the Friday time just because I don't want that much availability on Friday. But whatever, I will rejigger this. Just click on that link and you can book appointments that way. Very rarely I might be over in the CCR, but probably just come look for me in Torrey 424. And if you need to create an appointment, right, you basically just click on one of these and it asks you to enter your name, your email, and things like the course, reason for meeting, and whether you want it online or in person. You can reach me by email here. I have because I did my undergrad here when U of A started issuing students email addresses. So I have the derpiest email address ever, jrb5@ulberta.ca. But you can reach me there. I will warn you, I'm teaching 3 spring classes this term, and I have just a little bit over 400 students. So my email is something of a ongoing and roving disaster. I'm really bad at email in general. I'm always behind on it, and almost 90% of my emails begin with apologies. That it took. I wrote like 3 of these today because it had been 10 days since someone sent me an email, and I was like, ooh, yeah, that's verging on 2 weeks. Probably not good, but I was marking people's final exams, so I'll take that as my excuse. You can email me if there's something that you need. Happy to do it. I will say for this semester, Usually I say 48 hours, but for this semester, since everything is so compressed, if you haven't heard back from me in about a day, just forward the email again and just say, hey, I think you might have missed my email, or just making sure this is at the top of your list. And usually that cues me in. I will say, I don't know how valid this is, but one of the classes I'm teaching this semester is SOC 100. And for whatever reason, SOC 100 comes with an enormous amount of, shall we say, obvious questions that come to my email box. Like just honestly today, like 5 of them that were like, when are the exams? I'm like, well, all of the exams are both listed on the syllabus and on Canvas. How long are they? Well, it says an hour on the syllabus and in my opening lecture. Right, all things that could have been easily answered by the syllabus. SOC 100 is kind of like that. My wife has sometimes joked that she's going to get me a t-shirt that says it's on the syllabus that I could just wear when I teach SOC 100. Anyway, that doesn't really help me. This one's online. So whatever, no big deal. They do tend to overwhelm my inbox with questions ranging from the obvious to the super obvious. Even though it says all exams are non-cumulative, inevitably coming up to the second midterm, I'll get 20 or 30 emails that are like, is the exam cumulative? And there you go. So they are not, as they are not in this class either. Okay. I was going to say any questions, but this is all about me, so you probably don't have any questions about me. Okay. Maybe I'll explain this really quickly. So we're a pretty small class. I mean, I think 60 people are registered, so feel free to raise your hand and ask. If you just want to ask a question, do feel free to just raise your hand. And if sometimes I get in the zone and I don't see you, just, shout at me and be like, hey, I have a question. No problem. It's a small room. All good. If, however, you don't want to raise your hand and ask a question, this is a sort of alternative. It's called Slido. If you've ever had a class with me before, you'll be well acquainted with Slido. But basically, you just go to slido.com. I can't write on this slide. Go to slido.com, enter that code, or scan that QR code with your phone or other device, and it'll take you to like a Q&A page where you can type your questions in. And I know some people get really shy about asking questions, or you think you're going to look dumb, or whatever. So this is a way to get around that. You can just ask your questions through Slido. And again, feel free to raise your hands. I'm more than happy to take questions by human being, but if you'd rather have questions by technology, that also works. Okay, so maybe before I do evaluations, I will step back. Oop, that looked like there was a question, then it disappeared. I guess just like for the class, right? So obviously this class is scheduled Monday, Wednesday from 1 till 3:50 p.m. That's a pretty long go, and especially, it's a lot of lecture. I've tried in the past doing things like presentations and group projects, and students hated me. So I see the relief on your face specifically when you realized that I was going to say no presentations or group projects. So it's pretty much straight lecture with 3 exams. That said, we will break about midway through, probably for 15 to 20 minutes, so people can go to the bathroom, get a fresh cup of coffee, do whatever you need to do in that period. So I won't go for the full 3 hours. Okay. So the course, really, really straightforward in terms of evaluations. Basically, we've got 3 exams worth about 1/3 each. The first midterm, which is the Wednesday after the May long weekend. That is the date of the first midterm. The second midterm, I don't remember. It's on the syllabus. I wrote it down so I wouldn't have to remember, but it is there. And then the final exam, I believe, is June 12th, right? So 2 days after, we end on June 10th. That's the Wednesday of the end of the term. And, it's 2 days after that. Okay, so, and I'll provide example questions in the class prior to the exam. So the way that, typically I do things in the spring term, I do this in winter and fall as well, is the exams, I don't have you do them in class, and specifically, one of the reasons is this room, because as I can already see, some of you are precariously trying to balance your giant laptops on desks that are about this big, because the U of A, I think this room has to be like next on the renovation list. But yeah, these desks are from like the 1970s when I presume paper was only that big. I don't actually know. It doesn't really make sense. These desks have never made sense for anything. And I swear to God, I've been rewatching like the original Star Trek with my daughter, and those chairs look like chairs from the original Star Trek, which was filmed in the late 1960s. So I'm pretty sure these chairs are from the 1960s. So super comfortable room, great desks. I don't have you write in here. I have you basically write at home. And basically on the day of the exam, again, I just don't remember what the date of that Wednesday is. I want to say the 20th, but now that sounds wrong in my head too. Basically, I leave the exam open, from midnight to 11:59, right? So you can write it anytime, right? When you do go to write it, you get 90 minutes, right? So you can kind of work it in with your schedule whenever you want to write it. And generally what I do is that day, instead of having a full 3-hour class, instead we have an hour and a half class. So like we'll go from 1:30 to 2:30, and then we'll stop there, right? And then, because I don't want to give you extra work, right? Not 3 hours of class, and then you have to go home and write a 90-minute exam. I don't think that's fair. So instead, we'll just have a shorter class that day. And then you can scamper off to tables with actual space on them to write your exams, or go home, or whatever you want to do. Okay, and I'll talk more about that, I guess, next Wednesday, because that'll be, the class before that exam. And I'll give you lots more details, and we will look at some practice questions, and I can kind of walk you through how you might answer them. Okay, any questions so far? Is it on the syllabus? I sure hope so. Otherwise, I look the fool, which has happened plenty of times. That's okay. I think for my SOC 100, I realized this morning that I had changed the dates, but it still said spring 2025 syllabus, because I just, basically changed the dates, except for the one at the very top. So hopefully it's all on the syllabus. Exams are not cumulative, right? So basically, you kind of do them in 3 little chunks. Some of the concepts might carry over from one section to another, especially some of the more theoretical ones, but you wouldn't be asked to, say, re-explain something from midterm 1 on midterm 2 or the final. You might just be asked to relate, questions I often use is how does this concept, that we talked about in the second third of the course relate to things we talked about in the first part of the course, right? So you don't have to re-explain them. You just have to kind of link ideas together. Okay, and yeah, all of the exams are 5 short answer questions. You could literally hear a ring drop or a pin. There are 10 marks each. And usually the questions are broken up into either 2 or 3 parts, right? So, when I show them to you, you'll kind of understand better what that means. But basically it's hey, define this concept, and B, link this concept to something else we've talked about in the class. Those are usually 2 parts. And usually worth 5-ish marks per part. Depending on the question, it might vary a little bit. Okay. Oh, that's a good question. It is on the syllabus, but I must now clear your question if I can find my mouse. The exams are open book, right? So basically, you just log into Canvas and you write the exam. I don't have any proctoring software, so I'm not making you use Lockdown browser or anything like that. You can use your notes. You can feel free to use anything. AI is strongly discouraged, and I often write the questions in such a way as AI will give very terrible answers. And trust me, it was all over the final exam that I just finished marking. I finished marking the exams for this class on Friday, so I'm having extreme deja vu. I'm I just finished this class in the winter term, and now I'm back. We're doing it all over again. The way the questions are worded, the AI answers often stick out like a sore thumb because they're super vague and super general, and they don't do a particularly good job. And every semester I go back through the questions and I tweak them, basically to just screw with AI as much as possible. It's not quite as bad as my SOC of religion class, where I have one question that everyone gets because I know every single AI model I've tested gets the question wrong. So then you can 100% see who's understood the concept and who's using AI. That's what I call my mean question. I don't have a mean question in this class, but it's good. Would there be lecture recordings available? Excellent question. Yes, there are. In fact, I am recording it right now. So, again, if you go to the homepage of the course and you go on recorded lecture playlist, it will take you to YouTube. Slowly, because the Wi-Fi here is wonderful. Right, and what you see, obviously, I am recording this and streaming it right now. So it is live. I won't click on it because then you'd hear me talking and it's like an echo and that would be bad. Yeah, it's all there. You can click on there. If you miss class one day, I don't know, if you have to take an extra shift at work, it doesn't matter to me, right? If I end up in this room talking to myself, by myself, I'm okay with that too. It's spring. You got to do what you got to do. So yeah, all the lectures will be there. They should be there the moment I start lecturing, as long as I remember to link them. If not, I usually do it after class. But yeah, even if you're sick and you want to, or lazy, I don't know which one, and you just want to stay home and be in your bunny slippers on your bed, but you still want to follow the class, you can do that, and you could still ask questions, right? So you could still use the Slido and ask questions like you are here. And honestly, this is a very popular option, especially in the winter term when it's like minus 1,000 degrees, which never happens in Edmonton, or the snow has hit us. Thanks for that. I appreciate the humor. How long are the exams and how many questions are there? And are they long or short answer? How many multiple choice? Okay. Okay. Yes. So they are all the lectures there. Is the final exam written online or in person? It is online. Yeah. So you don't have to come that day. You just have to do it within that 24-hour window. I'm all about trying to give people more flexibility, especially in the spring, because I know spring, how to put it, it's just a different semester. It tends to be one that is a little bit hard because you're balancing lots of different priorities, but still, trying to get that one extra class in and done so you can make your fall and winter better. Okay. Love it. Okay. I think that's good. All right. So we're going to jump into this in a second. We're going to jump right into course content in a couple of minutes. But I'll just tell you a little bit about the course. And hopefully it sounds interesting. Okay. So basically we're going to talk about youth, right? As a social category and a social construct. But a lot of the course is just kind of trying to get into what's happening with young people, what's affecting them, what kind of changes have taken place in their lives, and just kind of trying to describe it and give some of these things that you're probably experiencing in your own lives a sort of academic name, right? Put names on things to kind of try and categorize what your experiences are like and what we're seeing as big statistical trends. Now, that said, we are also going to go way back into the past, right? So where we're going to start, the course today is talking sort of about the history of childhood and youth. And then, we're going to go really far back, trust me, into, really the Middle Ages, and then kind of move forward from there. And then, kind of the second unit of the course, which I have them here, so I'm saying this slightly out of order. We're going to talk about some of the different generations, and especially the more kind of recent ones historically, and what life was like for them when they were young. And we're going to look at lots of stuff. It'll be, I think, pretty interesting. I always like this class, and it's fairly popular, which, I don't know. Either it just fits people's schedules really well, or people find the topic really interesting. But I think the topics are quite interesting. We're going to look at things like how youth is managed, but especially like more youth experiences of society and changes in social structures that are really changing the way young people experience and move through life. Okay, yeah, so basically this should be everything that's on the first exam. We're going to talk about the history of childhood and youth, right? So we're going to start on that in a couple of minutes. And like I said, we're going to go way back in the past and talk about where our particular notion of youth and childhood really comes from. It's far less natural than we sometimes assume it is. Then we're going to talk about what I call the cultural world of generations. And here we're going to look basically at the 5 most recent generations, right? So we're going to go back a fair ways here as well. We're going to look at the silents, the baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, oops, I lied, 6, and a little bit on Gen Alpha. And Gen Alpha, I'll give you a slight disclaimer. They're just coming into our data sets, so we don't know much about them, but what we know, I think, is really, really interesting. And then we'll end like the first third of the course talking about education, and really what's happened with education in the last probably 25 years, and how it's fundamentally really changed the way young people kind of move through their life course. Okay, the second part, we're going to talk about families. And I don't know, I find this really interesting, especially we're going to talk, I redid this unit a few years ago, and I keep finding new and interesting things to talk about. Marriage and what marriage looks like for young people today when they're getting married, what their expectations of marriage are, and how those expectations have changed, and how it's maybe changing a lot of things in terms of, again, how they move through life. We're going to talk about, I guess about fertility, or, basically having kids, and how, particularly one theory of how status is really affecting fertility in a downward direction. And then we're going to end off, essentially with sort of economics, and sort of asking the question, what is the best family form for young people? Right? So where do young people tend to thrive the most, in what sort of families, right? Blended families, nuclear families, one-parent families, whatever. What's the best form, and why? Why do they tend to thrive in that kind of family structure? All right, then we're going to talk about work. Kind of, again, a little bit of a history of work, really from the middle of the 20th century to the present, and how young people's experience of the labor market has changed, and some of the forces that are affecting it, right? So we're going to talk about work. And then sex and intimacy, we're going to talk about, what are my 3 topics in here? Well, we'll talk about, something that people have started talking about in the last few years. Sex recession, right? What is going on, and why are people, not just Gen Z and Gen Alpha, but people in general, having way less sex than they did in the past? We're going to talk a little bit about hookup culture, and then we will talk about porn and pornography's effect on how people experience sex and intimacy. So that is always fun. All right, and we're going to end, the last part of the course with sort of 4 topics. I think this is how it'll work. Depending on the pacing of the class, we might go, some of these units might shift around from 1/3 of the course to the other. We'll talk religion and spirituality, and look at really the experiences of both millennials when they were young, and then Gen Z as they're coming into our data, what they think about religion and spirituality and how they construct it. And then we're going to end kind of with I guess 3 units, I will say, are slightly, maybe a little bit depressing. I had one student lovingly tell me last class that she came to my class for her microdose of depression every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And I'm like, okay, I'm sorry. It's sociology. We're all depressing. That's what we do. We tell you life is bad and how to fix it. No, wait. We tell you life is bad, and then we don't tell you how to fix it. That's what we do. But Marx knew, right? That's, Marx, Durkheim, Weber, run. So we'll talk about, what was kind of, I refer to as the crisis of boys and men. What's going on with young men particularly, and why aren't they thriving? Why are they struggling in a lot of ways? We'll talk about youth and health, and here I really do focus on mental health. Looking at trends, and then what might be some of the drivers. And then we'll end off, talking about technology, specifically mostly social media and smartphones, and their potential effect on young people, right? Okay. Yeah. I will say, if you have any suggestions for me, right, do feel free to kind of just let me know. I try to accommodate things. Oh, does anyone want subtitles? I don't know if this helps. This is where, sometimes people tell me something that's really helpful. Someone's like, would you be able to turn on subtitles? And it's actually like ridiculously easy. And then of course I turn on the subtitles, and then they're like, great, I can hear you better now, which makes you sound like an old person if you say that, by the way. But I understand, right? We're so used to having subtitles. And actually, Microsoft PowerPoint does an actually reasonably decent job of live subtitling lectures if I remember to turn it on. So someone was like, hey, would you mind trying to turn on subtitles? And actually, people said it really helped. So little things like that, right? Super easy for me to do, as long as my silly little brain remembers to turn on subtitles. And it can be really helpful for people, right, to have that, and then you can just kind of follow along. And if you missed something that I said, or you don't know what the word is, it's right there on the bottom of the slide. So yeah, sometimes, little things like this do really help people. However, I will say one of the funny things with Microsoft PowerPoint subtitling is it will not subtitle cursing. So if I say shit, you see, it leaves a blank space, which I discovered last time. Was it damn? It won't say damn. Yeah, I think I said damn. Anyway, it's funny, right? Microsoft is censoring me right now. I feel very oppressed. Okay, so there you go. If there's anything at all, do let me know. How many words is short answer? Oh, I hate this question, and I hate you for asking it. No. I have a really hard time with this one because I don't want to be too prescriptive about it, in the sense that if I tell you, 300 words, someone will write me 200 great words and 100 words of complete gibberish. And I hate that. I would say, generally speaking, good answers tend to be somewhere in the range of 250 to 350 words. Per short answer. Longer than that, I do find people tend to run on and be trying to put too much in the question. Shorter than that, and you just don't include enough. That said, right, I have seen people write somewhat shorter answers that are still really, really good. Some people will structure them like in point forms, with details written in, which sometimes are easier to mark, so I enjoy those. So there's not like one singular way of answering these questions, but yeah, I would say somewhere between 250 and 350 words is good. And I'll talk about structure when I talk about the questions too, because there's a few things that when you're writing your answers make it a lot easier for me to mark, and make it a lot easier for you to, when you're revising your answers, to see maybe whether you answered the question correctly. I mean, not correctly, but fully answered the question is probably a better way of putting it. But I'll talk about that next Wednesday, when we're ending off and moving towards you writing the midterm. But yeah, about 250 to 350 words. Anywhere in the middle of that should be fine. And what I will say, I'll say this, and I'll say this again later, because Canvas is Canvas, on occasion, people have had trouble where answers get erased. So I would encourage you to write your answers, say in Microsoft Word or Google Docs, or if you're using a Mac and you feel like hurting yourself, you can use Pages, I guess. I really hate Pages, mostly because nothing will open a .pages extension. So in other classes where people submit essays, they'll submit it in .pages, and I'm like, I guess I have to download it on my iPad now or something. Anyway, I hate Pages. It's stupid. It's also a bad word processor, but aside from that, no problems. Anyway, write it in whatever word processor and then copy paste it into Canvas. That usually helps. And then, if something happens, you have a document that's like, hey, this is my answers. I'm sorry, half of them got cut off on Canvas for some reason, because Canvas is something of a, well, you've all been using it now for a year, right? So you know the vagaries of Canvas. Usually works pretty well, but sometimes doesn't. Okay, are the readings necessary or supplementary? I always think of readings as supplementary. The courses, the lectures, and the material that you will need to answer the questions is all in the lectures, right? So if all you have is the lectures, you'll be fine. That said, I do think the readings are very good and can be really helpful for better understanding the concepts, for clarifying things, for getting a little bit of extra information that you can put into those short answer questions on the exam if you want. Again, I'm not necessarily expecting that. I know it's spring and everybody is time strapped and stressed out a little bit, and you're probably trying to fit this class in between other things, or you are one of those crazy people that's like, I'm going to take 3 spring classes. Why anyone would do that to themselves, I don't know. I teach 3 spring classes, but I am a crazy person. So don't take 3 spring classes. But if you do, right, the readings are supplemental for your interest, but everything you need to answer the questions is in the slides. My opinion on brain rot. I think it is appropriately titled. I think, that is what it is. There's increasing bodies of evidence suggesting that it's making you all stupider. So that's great. Reading scores are down, like reading comprehension scores, writing ability scores are way down. You can hardly get people to read a book anymore. But for some reason, watching someone cook a recipe with like, did you know that if you combine a tortilla with 17 eggs, you'll get something inedible? Lots of those. Are you following a case in the U.S. regarding meta harming young women and girls and actually being able to get around Section 230? I kind of have been following it in past. So Section 230 is the one that defines platforms as not being responsible for the content on them. I think I saw the one case where they were found liable. It was Meta and YouTube, I think, were found liable for not for basically creating platforms that were addictive and it harmed someone's mental health, which I think is appropriate. Like, the more you find out about, especially Meta as a company, the more we should probably drag Mark Zuckerberg out, tie rocks to his feet, and throw him into the sea. My favorite piece of Meta insider information was, this came out of corporate memos. Instagram in particular, we think is pretty harmful to girls. And my favorite thing about this is they figured this out quite a while ago, right? That girls are quite visually oriented and subject to visual comparison with other girls and women. And instead of doing something to address that, they were like, what would happen if we realized that a girl starts to think that she's unattractive? We could aggressively market makeup and diet products to her in ads, right? And they're like, we should do that. That's going to make us a lot of money. And that is what they did. So when I say Mark Zuckerberg should probably be dragged into the sea, I I mean that sincerely and with love. But they've clearly known that what they're doing is harmful to people, but not doing that would have cut into their bottom line. So, they didn't do that. So yeah, I think all of this stuff is being shown to be quite harmful. And I mean, like with young kids, right, the so-called iPad kids, we're seeing huge language delays, right? Kids showing up to kindergarten with what looks like autism symptoms, but it's not autism. They just haven't been properly socialized because their parents just throw them in front of a screen, and hand them a screen all the time instead of interacting with them. We're seeing a lot of harms. It's going to take a really long time for us to figure all of the harms out. But thankfully, I also think we're starting to get some of these things addressed. Governments are starting to step up, like Australia banning social media for everyone under 16 years old, which I think is, if you want my opinion, completely appropriate. And I wish they would do it here. So hopefully we get there at some point. Laptops are probably next. Okay. I'm gonna exit this. Discard all my scribbles. I do love doodling. Oh, what are you? Intriguing. We're gonna worry about that. Okay. Just want to make sure my stream is still streaming everything. Good. Love you, OBS. You're the best. All right. So, I don't know why it bothers me that the door's open. It just does. Need to trap you all in here with my terrible jokes. Okay. So, our first kind of topic, we're going to talk about the history of childhood, and here I'm going to include youth. So one of the things that I will say for the course in general is I take a pretty broad view of what constitutes youth in this class, and sort of in general terms, I'm going to put youth. Hey, I thought I switched you to yellow. There we go. I put youth as somewhere between 12 and 29. So it's a really, really broad brush to paint with, but I think it is an appropriate one. Now, obviously within that, we have a few different kind of categories, right? We'll have our early teens, we'll have our late teens. So early teens, we'd be talking about, kind of 12 to about 16. Late teens, 17 to 19. And then this category, which is our emerging adults, right? Hey, I lost my subtitles. Oh dear. Right. So early teens, ET, 12 to 16. Late teens, 17 to 19. And then our emerging adults, roughly like, say, 19 or 20 to about 29. And we'll dig into this term more as we go through the course, especially because it's one that I think, we start talking about emerging adults kind of in the mid-2000s as we realize that people are growing up slower and hitting a lot of those big life milestones a lot later than they used to. But we'll talk about that more when we talk about our generations, especially Gen Z. Okay. But here we're going to talk about a kind of history of childhood and where our modern idea of childhood comes from. Because, childhood and youth, right? And here, I'm going to be taking a lot from this book, which is Neil Postman's The Disappearance of Childhood. Sometimes if I write at the top of the screen, it randomly wants to kick me out of the slides. I don't know why. It doesn't do it on my other computer, just on this one. Right, so Neil Postman's The Disappearance of Childhood. It's kind of an old book written at the end of the 1970s. I think it does a nice and fairly friendly kind of explanation of childhood and where childhood comes from, at least our notion of childhood in the West. Okay, same Slido as before. All right, so Postman. Postman's one of my personal favorites. And again, if you've taken enough classes with me, you'll probably hear Postman's name come up a few times. I talk about him a lot, especially in this class. And then just switch pen colors again. In this class, and especially in my critical media studies class, which I teach in the fall, I sound like a internet influencer, like pitching my other videos in the middle of my video. I'm really not. That class is already full, so you can't even get in. Okay, computer. All right, I can only write towards the bottom of the screen. So Postman, one of my particular favorites, right? Someone that I read when I was in undergrad. And it continues, I think, to be referenced a lot. And you'll hear his name pop up a few times in the course about different things. He's technically a media scholar, right? He founds a school of thought called media ecology at New York University, which is all about how the media changes the social environment that humans live in major ways, which is largely what this book is about as well. And he wrote a whole bunch of interesting books. His most famous by far is one called Amusing Ourselves to Death, where he talks about the corrosive influence of television on public discourse. He died in 2003. I think if he had seen like Twitter or, mostly Twitter, he probably would have had a stroke. But yeah, Amusing Ourselves to Death, where he says everything becomes entertainment because of television. This one, The Disappearance of Childhood, where he kind of maps out how one particular technology, which we'll talk about in a sec, sort of slowly over time gave us our notion of what childhood and youth are. And then some other books, which we don't need to talk about, which are also interesting, which are sort of techno-critiques about how we tend to give too much of our lives over to new technologies. Okay, which again could be a fun theme for the class. All right. So Postman, somewhat like what I'm doing here in this class, he is defining childhood in a relatively broad sense, right? He's going to go a little bit younger than I think what we're interested in here. And I think sociology of childhood specifically is a slightly different discipline than, say, sociology of youth. But when he's talking about childhood, he's talking about basically 7 to 17-year-olds, right? And yeah, it overlaps with how we're going to talk about, youth in this class, although it starts a bit earlier and ends a bit earlier as well, because it doesn't include emerging adulthood, right? And largely, I think, though Postman will make sort of reference to what I think would be almost a prototype of the concept later in the book, in a part that we won't talk about. He talks about the adult child, right? I don't know why it started doing that. Oh, it's probably because I have the subtitles on. All right, lower. The adult child. Okay, so the adult child. Are you not entertained? I'm kidding. Are you not entertained? Sorry. The adult child, right? Emerging adult is something of a similar concept, right? People who are technically adults by a legal definition, but haven't necessarily hit some of those markers of adulthood, like, a career, family, getting married or getting into a serious relationship, family, or whatever, right? So he references this later in the book. But his kind of notion of childhood is right around here from 7 to 17. Okay, now, one of the things that I do think makes Postman interesting and useful, and he's, with other people like Elizabeth Eisenstein who make a similar distinction, is, whereas I think we tend to think of childhood as a biological category, right? Childhood is, when you're little, right? And that's true in a sense, but there's also a really strong social component to what we consider a child, right? And what we consider their responsibilities, their roles, and when things like childhood end, right? When they begin, when they end, and what it means to be a child, right? So he would largely consider childhood to be a social construct. All right. So I said we were going to go back really, really far. So here we're going to go back to the Greeks. Why? Well, I mean, at heart, Postman is a classicist, right? You know, someone born in the 1930s who was educated at Columbia University. And so a big part of that education would have been the classics. So if you read people from this kind of time period, they always want to go back to the Greeks and the Romans, right? Which everyone considers sort of the foundation of Western thought, to see where that happens. Now, I will say this, and I'll say this for your midterms. What sometimes happens is if you get a question, saying something like outline the history of youth and childhood, what I think sometimes people do, and I know this because I marked these, not so many months ago, people kind of talk a lot about the Greeks and Romans and then fail to talk about the stuff that follows. The Greek and Roman stuff here is just a kind of footnote, right? To sort of set the stage a little bit for what comes later. Now, I will say this, the Greeks, and again, the Greeks, why do we talk about the Greeks? Well, the Greeks are, pretty important in kind of the history of Western thought. This is where a lot of our ideas sort of emerge. Okay, so Postman wants to be like, okay, so if we look at sort of the founding civilizations of the West, did they have a notion of childhood? And the truth is, when we talk about the Greeks, they really didn't, right? At least not in a particularly modern sense. So if any of you are kind of Christians and you know kind of the biblical texts, right, you probably kind of would understand this reasonably well. It's in Romans, I think, Paul's letter to the Romans, right, which is written in Greek. Paul uses the word pedos, right? Which means basically, if you're looking at it in the Greek, means infant, right? And so there's this very famous passage in, again, I think it's Romans, now I don't remember, that where Paul says, when I was an infant, I thought as an infant, I acted like an infant, but now that as a man, I've left behind, infantile things. It often gets translated in modern English as, when I was a child, but the word is pedos, and it literally means infant, right? So there is no specific word for child in Greek. The closest thing we have is pedos, which really means infant. And this is where, we get the charming English words. Pediatrician, right, comes from pedos, the Greek pedos. And of course, the less charming pedophile also comes from the word pedos in the Greek, right? So, now what the Greeks do have is a really broad concept of youth, but it's kind of a weird one, right? Youth isn't like a specific age. Youth is more like a way of being in Greek, and it is the time where you are being educated, right? Now, typically this would have started at the earliest, probably around 10 years old. It would have largely been relegated to citizens, right? So especially if we're talking places like Athens, and Thebes, and some of the other Greek city-states, it would only been citizens of those cities that would have been considered youth in this way, right? So it wouldn't have included, for example, women and slaves, right? And slaves made up a really large part of the Greek world because they are the ones who did most of the work. Okay, so our citizens, right, they were youth while they were being educated, probably started at around 10 years old, right? If you were wealthy enough that your parents could send you to be educated, right, you would go to some great philosopher, an Aristotle or a Plato or a Socrates or someone else, and you would go and listen to them and you would ask them questions, and they would ask you questions, and you'd go off and think about those questions and come back and answer the question that your master had asked, right? So-called Socratic method. And that's what education sort of looked like. But there was no particular, it's not like today, right, where it's like, okay, you're in school from the time that you're around 5 years old until you're 18, right? And then college or university is from 18 to like 22, 23, right? It wasn't that clearly defined, right? You could be a youth who was being educated, into your 30s and 40s, right? It was more about the social role that you were playing rather than your age, right? So youth here doesn't mean youth in the way that we mean it. So in a sense, the Greeks, this is a useless slide because the Greeks give us really nothing particularly useful aside from a word, like pedos, which we adapt to our own purposes. Okay, so the Romans. Obviously, if we look back at the West, the Romans are also really important. For Postman, he suggests that the Romans had a much more defined view of childhood than the Greeks did. And this largely seemed to come down to the notion that they had a sense of shame, right? And particularly a shame connected to things that children shouldn't know about, right? So things like, sex, politics, economics, and war were things that should not be divulged to children, and you shouldn't talk about them, right? And we have letters from prominent Roman citizens berating some of their fellows, for being too lascivious in their talk around children at, say, a dinner party, right? Or for talking about sex and politics in front of children, which was seen as inappropriate. Now, the reason Postman thinks the Romans probably had this sense of childhood, whereas the Greeks didn't, is that the Romans, had a slightly different social organization, right? So if you know anything about the Romans, right, you know that the Roman Empire was really, really big, right? It basically, at its height, spanned all the way, basically to, up the British Isles up to Scotland, right? The Scots always resisted the Romans. They never got past the Scots, but they had basically the whole of what we'd call England and Wales today. So in the north, that was as far as the Romans got, and they basically controlled, down through most of kind of France, parts of Germany, parts of like Romania, Switzerland, and all around the Mediterranean basin, right? That was all the Roman Empire. Now, what do you need when you have such a big empire? Well, you need a way to communicate orders from the center, from Rome, to the fringes, right? And so you needed people to be able to read, right? So you had in the Roman Empire, especially amongst Roman citizens, relatively high for the ancient world rates of literacy, somewhere probably around 10 to maybe 12% of the population being able to read. And this would have been your scribal class, your leadership class in the military, who are basically able to take, written instructions along those fabulous Roman roads to different parts of the empire. What happens when people learn how to read? It's a slow process that has to be started in childhood, right? So you get a separation of children who are being educated and adults who are already educated. And that split seems to be really important to having a notion of childhood, right? A control of information, a sense that some things are shameful and people shouldn't know about them. Okay. All right, so I have to admit, I have seen in my YouTube stream things about Pragmata, but I don't know anything about it. So I haven't actually read anything about Pragmata. Possible effects on child birth rates. I'm gonna have to dig into this. I'm super kind of interested in questions around fertility and why birth rates are dropping, which we'll get into later in the course, but I hadn't heard a link between Pragmata. I don't know, there's so much junk on the internet. What is Pragmata? Is it a game? Is everyone playing this game? No? Okay. Well, if not everyone is playing this game, it probably only has a minor effect. But I will see if I can dig into this and figure out if it has an effect on birth rates. I mean, I assume it's relatively recent, so probably not. Okay. Okay, how am I doing for time? All right, it's already 2 o'clock. My, how the time flies when you're talking about video games that I know nothing about. Okay. So, what happens? Well, whatever is going on in the Roman Empire, at least in the western part of the Roman Empire, comes to an abrupt end in 476 AD, right? Now, coming up to this, the Roman Empire had been declining for a considerable amount of time, right? The capital of Rome had been moved from Rome to Ravenna, at least in the western part of the empire. In the eastern part, it's Constantinople. But Ravenna was much more secure because it was surrounded by swamps. German, the Romans called them barbarians, but basically German tribes had moved down into Roman lands and besieged the Roman Empire. And basically the thing had been falling apart for the better part of 150 years. And it officially collapses in the year 476. When basically a German warlord walks into Ravenna and tells the last Western Roman emperor, basically, you're out of a job, I'm in charge now, and the whole system kind of falls apart. All right, so what happens? Well, basically, from there, we get 1,000 years of what's referred to as the Middle Ages. Now, this used to be referred to as the Dark Ages, but nobody uses that term anymore. Because the Middle Ages are actually much more interesting and much more nuanced than calling them the Dark Ages tends to imply. Right? The implication has always been, since the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, that the Middle Ages were a time of ignorance where no progress happened and everybody was just a religious nut. That's largely a kind of silly bit of self-promotion, especially by the Enlightenment thinkers to make themselves seem better. But the Middle Ages definitely do have some fundamental shifts. And one of those is away from the imperial Roman system to a system called feudalism. Now, amongst other things, feudalism tends to be very local, right? You as a peasant produce food for the noble that owns the land that you and your family live on. He pays some of that on to the king or whoever rules the particular land that you're in. What it doesn't require is a lot of administration between far-flung regions. And so what happens is literacy plunges, right? Basically, you go from maybe 10 to 12% of people who are able to read to somewhere probably more in the range of, 1 to 2 in the Middle Ages, right? Because it's just not important. You don't need to be able to read. It essentially serves no purpose, right? Spending your time learning to read, when you could be growing food, is just not something that most people do. Now, the Catholic Church in this period, basically starts to play an incredibly important part in daily life, right? It largely replaces the Roman Empire as the sort of overarching structure in Western Europe. And it keeps knowledge alive, right? It preserves a lot of works of classical literature in its monasteries. It still educates people, and through the Middle Ages, it'll found the university system. Particularly we see medieval universities. I always forget the first one. Oxford, there's one before Oxford, but it always escapes me which one it is. Oxford, University of Paris, University of Gdansk, are all founded in the Middle Ages, essentially by the Catholic Church. But not a lot of people need to know how to read, and so not a lot of people do. And what happens is essentially whatever kind of childhood had existed in the Roman era basically disappears, right? The culture really reverts, from a somewhat literate culture to one that is almost entirely oral, right? So it's almost entirely spoken, right? Culture is transmitted through speech. And what Postman notes is that beyond, kind of learning basic language skills, which humans pick up relatively easily, there's no real hierarchy to the language that they learn, right? Most people learn the language of the people around them, and never anything more. They're not learning kind of higher abstraction language. They're not learning academic language, right? It's basically like the language you need to get by. So education serves really no purpose. Okay. The other thing, people in the Middle Ages tend to live in really close quarters, right? Typically, a family, like a peasant family, is going to live in a one-room hut or one-room, basically one, hut. I think hut is the appropriate word. Not hot, hut. Thank you for correcting that, Microsoft PowerPoint. HUT. A one-room hut, right? And typically, what they get to experience is pretty much everything, right? If you lived in a one-room building with your parents and your siblings, and your parents are still producing new siblings, you would have a pretty good idea of how those siblings were produced, right? So there's not a lot of privacy. There's no sense of personal or private space. If you had said, to someone in the Middle Ages, I just need you to give me some personal space, they would have looked at you like you have 17 heads, because what you have said is nonsense to them, right? It would make no sense because nobody had personal space. And children are not shielded from the adult world from a very young age. Children are part of the adult world, right? So children are, for instance, working at a relatively young age, right? Probably from ages 5 or 6, children are at very least involved in the work on the farm, right? On their family's farm. So they're doing tasks that they're able to do, right? Chores. And as they get older and more physically able, they do more. Or at maybe 6 or 7, particularly the boys, are going to be sent off to apprentice under someone who does a trade, right? So you might send your 7-year-old off to apprentice with a blacksmith or a cobbler or a miller, right? So they could, or a baker, so they could learn that trade. But education in a hierarchical sense, right, where you learn one skill after another, and especially reading, essentially disappears through the Middle Ages because, again, it's not really needed. Oh, other things, right? Children know all about sex from very young ages, and Postman has some charming anecdotes in the book about how we have accounts from the Middle Ages of grown adults grabbing the genitals of children and laughing about it. Things that would get you sent to prison today. But in the Middle Ages, this is perfectly sort of normal for whatever reason. Okay, so the big kind of change that happens, right? And so again, right, we get about 1,000 years of this from about 476 till around 1440. Oops, 1440, right? And what happens in 1440? Well, we get the invention of the printing press, right? We think it's around 1440. We don't have an exact date, but pretty close therein, right? And it's invented by a guy named Johannes Gutenberg. Gutenberg's a kind of interesting character. He's a sort of entrepreneur, right? And what he realizes is books are really valuable, right? Like, books are super expensive, right? I'm going to put like they do if you go on Yelp or something to know how much it's going to cost you to eat out. $4 signs. Books are $4 signs. Why? Well, because basically books have to be copied by hand, right? So if you want a copy of Aristotle, somebody has to sit there and copy, Aristotle by hand for you, right? So they have to know how to write, and it's going to take them a while. Or, the most valuable book of all, of course, because we're in the Middle Ages, is the Bible. And if you've ever, right, held a Bible, right, you know that it is a very thick book. And just imagine for a moment, if you had to hand copy the Bible, right, how long do you think that would take you, right? And I mean, you have modern paper and things like ballpoint pens. It would take you a really, really long time, right? So because, the amount of labor that goes into a product often equals its cost, books are really, really expensive. And Gutenberg figures this out, So he figures this out, and he is a goldsmith by trade, right? So he can make things out of gold. So he's like, well, I should find a way to make a whole bunch of Bibles, right? Because I could sell those at an enormous profit. And he does. He basically gets an old wine press. He forms basically letters out of lead. Right? He's not going to use gold for it, but lead is pretty soft and malleable. So he forms letters out of lead. And eventually, after borrowing a whole crap ton of money, see, crap ton is fine, but damn is not okay. Come on, Microsoft. Right? He borrows a bunch of money. And he makes his printing press, and he prints a bunch of Bibles. Now, for a lot of really interesting and complicated historical reasons, Gutenberg is a great innovator. He's not a great businessman. He doesn't manage to recoup his costs on his Bible sales. And so he goes bankrupt. His creditors seize all of his assets, including the printing press, and they figure out that this thing is incredibly valuable, and they set about copying it, right? And Gutenberg lives a pretty good life. You know, he ends up being given some high royal position in some German kind of province, right? He's well treated, but his invention gets seized and copied, and it goes everywhere, right? Within a century, there's basically printing presses in every country in Europe. And it honestly changes the whole European continent, right? By less than a century later, right? So we're in 1440. One of the big effects of the printing press happens in 1517 with the beginning of what is called the Reformation, or the Protestant Reformation, right? Where basically people use the printing press to get out a bunch of anti-Catholic texts and basically found churches that split off from Roman Catholicism. Now, that said, Europe is in an interesting place when Gutenberg invents the printing press, and it really, really takes off. And it's interesting. Oh, maybe I'm giving you too much historical trivia. I don't know. It's interesting because, like, technically speaking, the Chinese had invented printing with movable type centuries earlier, but it never went anywhere in China, right? It was seen as like a trinket. For whatever reason, it really resonates in Europe for a couple of reasons. For one, you have a sort of rediscovery of classical works that people have been wanting to read, but were really hard to get your hands on, right? Copies of things like Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, any of the Greek and Roman thinkers, they were still there. Some of them had been re-imported from kind of the Arabs. Some of them had been held in, say, Irish monasteries, and some of them come to the West from Constantinople when Constantinople is sacked and basically conquered by the Ottoman Empire in 1453, right? It's only 13 years after the invention of the printing press. But there are all these texts that people want to read. There are other things too, right? The Europeans have learned how to make paper. Paper sort of found its way to Europe via the Silk Road from China, and the Europeans learned how to make relatively cheap paper. Prior to that, they'd been using parchment, which is made from animal hide, which is super expensive. Paper is a lot cheaper. And of course, ink, which they also get via the Silk Road through Central Asia from China. So they have all of these things that kind of come together, and there is a market, right? There's a market for printed products. So where there's a market, people create stuff. And printing goes crazy, right? Like I said, within a century, every country in Europe has a printing press. It's completely disrupted the whole kind of religious and cultural life of Europe in less than a century, right? By 1517, with the Protestant Reformation, things are happening, right? And it's largely driven by print. Okay, so what does this have to do with children? And we'll take a pause here soon because I'm running out of tea, and I cannot lecture without tea. It is impossible. Okay, so What Postman says is printing, like literacy had in the Roman period, creates a separation between children and adults. And largely it's around knowledge, right? In an oral culture, children know basically most of what adults know, right? Because everything is communicated orally and it's not that complicated. It's hard for it to build generation on generation. But when in a print culture, it becomes much easier for knowledge to be communicated, and adults who have known how to read for a while have a lot more knowledge than children do. And the printing press will ultimately, pave the way for things like industrialization and other things. But basically, that knowledge, right, gained through reading becomes the basis for adulthood, especially in an economic sense, right? In order to function in the economies to come in Europe, you're going to be able to know how to read, right? Because you're going to have to absorb a lot of complex information to become a really viable economic actor. So children, right, they can speak and understand speech relatively naturally, right? It doesn't require a lot, right? If you just talk to a baby, eventually that baby will learn how to speak, right? And eventually you won't be able to shut them up, right? They'll just keep talking. But reading is something that actually needs to be taught fairly deliberately, right? You can't just put a kid in front of a bunch of books and expect that they're going to learn how to read. They have to be instructed in it. And so for Postman, it's print that makes childhood, our concept of childhood, necessary, because it is, childhood ends up being that time of things like education, right? Where kids are going to be taught to read, right? Those skills that they're going to need for adulthood, right? And then a lot of other things are going to come along with this, but that separation between adults and children, and especially the pushing back of adult demands on children. So especially things like, the economy. Eventually, right, we push kids out of economic life, right? We define that, we get this notion eventually that childhood is a time of innocence and a time of leisure, right? Where we're supposed to play and learn and be innocent, but not work, right? So, and this takes a long time, right? But by the time we get to the 19th century, printing press is invented in the 15th century. By the 19th century, we start to get things like child labor laws, right? And we start to push kids out of the labor market and into this sphere of out of the economy into education, and we develop this notion that they're innocent, that childhood should be a time of delay, right? A delayed entry into adulthood, and a time of relative leisure before those adult demands get put on people. And for Postman, this all starts with the printing press. Now that said, it takes a solid 500 years, right? That's a 500, that didn't work out. 500 years for this to really kind of fully play out. This is a really, really slow cultural change, right? This new technology creates a bunch of new social realities, but it takes human beings about 500 years to really get from there to where we are today, right? To our kind of modern notion of childhood. Okay, how are we doing for time? Okay, I'm gonna, let me just see where we're at. Okay, I'm gonna do one more slide. This one is very quick, and then let's take like a 20-minute break. And I will refill my tea, and you will refill your will to live, I guess. Or coffee and a donut, or cookie. I guess the only thing open in Hub Mall seems like it's Cookies by George at this point. So there you go. All right, so Postman basically says he's got 3 conditions for childhood, right? Now the first one is shame, right? And shame is basically a function of a belief that, basically kids shouldn't know certain things, right? That there should be certain things that children are not privy to. And these are largely the same things that, say, the Romans were concerned about, right? It's things like sex, politics, religion, money, all things that we kind of think kids shouldn't know about, right? Because it's not their concern, right? And then if you tell kids about these things, that you have done something shameful. And I always think of my one friend, you know, I would say not the greatest of parents. I remember he had a son, I guess the kid would have been about 5 years old at the time this happened, which would have been about 10 years ago, or maybe more. Yeah, maybe 11, 12 years ago, whatever, it doesn't matter. And I had gone over to his house, and he had a few people over, and one of his other friends had brought her son that was about the same age, about 5, 6 years old. And they went off to play Xbox while the adults chatted, right? And he was playing Grand Theft Auto 5. And I can hear your reactions in the room. And when his mom found out, she made that sound like, what the hell? Like, why is my kid playing Grand Theft Auto 5, right? Because, it obviously has violence, it has sex, it has all those things that you really probably don't want a 5-year-old to know about, right? A 5 or 6-year-old to know about. And then my friend was like, oh, don't worry, I'll switch them over to Halo. That'll be way better. And it's like, okay. Yes, so much better. Like I said, not the greatest of parents. That's shame, right? The idea that kid shouldn't have been exposed to those things is the idea of shame, right? It's shameful to let kids know. And we need about certain things. That Postman thinks is essential to childhood. Along with that, we have literacy, right? And literacy is a system of information control, right? It's basically a way of controlling the information environment that kids have, right? Because if you're teaching them to read and you give them books on certain subjects, right, you control what they have access to, right? So you start with really basic things, really safe things, things that aren't shameful. And as they get older and more mature, you work your way up to those more adult themes. And how do you do this? How do you control that information environment? Well, you do it in schools. And school emerges as that fundamental social institution for controlling and slowly dribbling out information about the adult world, right? And there's a reason, right, where, when kids go through school, they get sex ed at certain times and certain topics at certain times. And, parents have to be informed and give their consent to it because, again, it's about a control system on information so that kids aren't exposed to things that they aren't ready for. Okay, let's pause here for 20 minutes. So come back at 2:41, around there. Refreshed, I hope. And we will continue on and talk some more. I'm going to go refill my tea. Okay, I guess we are back and ready to go again. Okay. So, about an hour. All right. So, what happens in Europe? With the invention of the printing press. Well, you get a whole bunch of new social categories created. Childhood is the one we're mostly kind of interested in, and this is one of the chapters in Postman's book. This word, the incunabula, means the cradle, right, or the crib of childhood. So the idea of childhood develops, like I said, over a roughly 500-year span. Okay, so children, they become an important category, right, principally because they need to be taught. And they need to be taught principally how to function in a print culture. So what happens relatively quickly by historical standards is education becomes a central goal, right? European governments and European monarchs realize that having an educated population comes with a whole lot of economic benefits at the end of the day. And whoever has the best economy, can produce the most weapons, and the person who can produce the most weapons wins the wars and is dominant, right? So education becomes a really important social goal for a couple of reasons, right? One of them is economic. The other one, especially in Protestant countries, is driven by sort of a Protestant ideology that says that, reading the Bible is something that every Christian should be able to do. And, because, in Protestantism, essentially everybody should read the Bible and interpret it for themselves. And therefore, teaching people how to actually do that becomes really important. Martin Luther, right? So can I write here without triggering my thing? Martin Luther, right? So Luther is the one essentially that starts the Protestant Reformation, right? We still have a church that bears his name, the Lutheran Church. And one of the things that he writes in his, it's called a catechism, which is basically, a set of instructions on what the teachings of the church is. What Luther writes in his catechism is that it's the duty of parents to teach their kids how to read so that they can interpret the Bible, right? And this is very important, especially in Protestant countries, right? One of these being Scotland, right? Scotland gets a brand of Protestantism called Presbyterianism, right? And Scottish Presbyterians, right, so this church in Scotland calls for a national system of education as early as 1560, right? So they're essentially calling for public schooling, only 120 years after the invention of the printing press. Now, it doesn't happen, right? You get only kind of sporadic efforts at it, but people are realizing how important it is to educate kids to be able to read. Okay. Okay, let's see. What type of tea? So I was going to make another cup of chai, but I've had a lot of chai today already. So this is whatever I found in the lunchroom. I think it's a hibiscus tea. It tastes pretty good. Okay. How long until the U.S. empire moves to Mar-a-Lago? Who knows? If I could predict Donald Trump, I would make a lot of money on Polymarket. Let me tell you that. I've proven, I'm like, he won't invade Iran. That's so silly. I was so right about that. It's a shame targeted towards children. Shameful that they would or should be, that they know they should be ashamed. Or is it generally just shameful that they've been exposed? I mean, I think the shame that Postman means here is more typically targeted towards adults, right? It's the idea that it's shameful for adults to let children in on these adult secrets. Now, it's also shameful for children to know these things, right? And there's likely a lot of shame that gets applied to kids at the same time. But I think the idea that Postman is going for is that it should cause you as an adult shame if you have, exposed a secret to children. You should be ashamed. Okay. So, not surprisingly, where literacy is high, I got T on my screen. Where literacy is high, there are schools, right? Not surprisingly, because there's no really other particularly effective way to increase literacy rates other than schools. Parents can teach children how to read, but parents' resources are going to be limited. Their own education and abilities are going to be limited. Schools are really much more effective at this. Now, where there are schools, a concept of children starts to develop, right? Now, again, this is a long process. It's not like, you get a whole bunch of schools and suddenly people have a 20th or 21st century notion of what childhood is. It takes a really, really long time, right? And I think, as a general rule, something that we could say, and I think something that will apply later in the course, and maybe technology is fast, like technology moves fast. Oops, I'm missing a no. Technology moves fast. What am I doing? I'm thinking a half step ahead of myself here. Culture moves very slowly, right? So I think part of our malaise today with smartphones and social media, technology moves fast, culture adapts very slowly. It takes a little bit of time. Okay, so You do see a cultural adaptation though, right? Once you get a lot of schools, right, you get a lot of literacy. Once you get schools, a notion of childhood starts to develop, right? Now, one of the places that gets there quicker than other places is England, right? So not the UK in general, but England specifically, right? So we're looking at that southern part of the British Isles, right? And we see a really rapid expansion. In 1480, there's 34 schools, right? So that's 40 years after the invention of the printing press. There's 34 schools in the whole of England. By 1660, there's 444, or one roughly every 12 miles. So it's roughly in walking distance. Like 12 miles is far, but it's reasonably walkable, right? So it's walking distance from almost every British person. There is a school. Okay. Now the important part. Schools change the relationship of adults to kids, right? Excuse me. And most importantly, they go from being sort of miniature adults, right, who are fully integrated into the economic life of their communities, right? They were small, but they were still working on family farms. They were still being trained, to become blacksmiths or, armorers, or I'm trying to think of medieval trades, and I don't know why. I've got like blacksmith, armorer, miller, baker, cobbler, whatever the trade happens to be, right? But they were already integrated into economic life, right? Because they were just little adults, right? They were, largely dressed in the same clothes, doing the same tasks, but just, what they were able to at their physical stature. And they go, in Postman's kind of sense, to being unformed adults, right? So people that need to be shaped by the adults around them. And basically, we go from a system where under the old apprenticeship system, childhood effectively ends at about 7 years old when you either working on the farm or you are learning a trade. Essentially, it gets longer and longer as time goes on, right? To the point where I saw a headline. I didn't read the article. I didn't want to. What was it? It was puberty actually continues well into your 30s. And I was like, okay, as someone with teenagers at home, I'm like, I don't even want to consider that mildly horrifying thought. I was like, we're just going to write that off. But I think, right, a lot of what's there is probably a social construction, right? That, oh yeah, there's this developmental thing that continues on into your 30s. Okay. So we had a cultural system that said, okay, at 7, you got to be economically productive. Why? Well, because otherwise you're just a mouth to feed, right? And not producing anything, to one that starts to lengthen this period where there are no demands put on you, right? Where, you don't really have to do a lot or produce a lot. Okay, so yeah, in school, that period where children were shielded from the demands of the adult world got longer, right? And again, it continues, this I think is continuing on. And we'll talk about that when we get into the education unit as well. But right, it might have been, kids would have gotten, if you went back to say the 17th century, maybe 3 or 4 years of education, right? Well, now, I mean, if you look at the norm today, right, it would be at very least 13 years, right? You're going to go from kindergarten until at least grade 12. So that's 13 years. But much more likely, you're talking about, an undergrad degree. So that's 17 years at least. If you're being really efficient, you get it done in 4 years, but you're all here in the spring because you're going to knock it off in 3.5 years, right? That's the plan, right? So 17 years, or now, increasingly, because people are talking about everybody needs a master's degree, potentially 19 years. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news. Not everyone needs a master's degree, but increasingly lots of people are going for them because there's that perception that the bachelor is worth less, right? So you see this kind of, stretching out of what you might call childhood or youth, right? Over centuries, we go from a few years learning basic skills, to, a solid 1/5 of a century where you're going to be in school. It sounds really bad when you say it like that, that it's 1/5 of a century. But yeah, basically there. Okay, so this period gets longer and longer, right? And that shielding from a lot of adult demands gets longer and longer as well. All right. Now, schools are a particular system that organize learning in particular ways, right? And it tends to be sequential and hierarchical, right? So you have to learn the basic skills first before you move on to more complex skills, right? So you're going to learn your ABCs, your basic arithmetic, before moving on to algebra, and then, not conics, trigonometry, calculus, and all of those things, right? But you learn it in a sequence, and we get to the point now where we've sequenced those things in grades, right? Where it's like, this is the sequence of learning that's meant to match the age, right? Yeah, so you need to learn one skill before moving on to another, and students start to be grouped by their age, right? Ability is tied to physical development, right? So this isn't the case at first, right? The early schools, it's like, just throw everyone in there who wants to learn and teach them. But as we segment young people or put them together, it's like, actually those 6-year-olds and those 11-year-olds have very different abilities. And so we start to split them up, and you get the beginnings of the grade system, along with noticing those developmental milestones people go through. Okay. So that's basically this point here, this second point. Quote from the book. When any group is formed on the basis of a characteristic, it's inevitable that other characteristics will be noticed, right? So when you put kids together, right, young people together, you start to notice more and more things about them, right? You start to treat them as a class, and you start to notice things, right? So amongst other things, right, by putting them all together into classes, what we get is the slow but steady kind of formation of youth cultures, right? And this will probably find its most refined form, but starting in like the 1950s and 1960s, right, in junior highs and high schools. By the time we get there and we have this really long, okay, that little S didn't deserve a screen switch. We have this really long tradition of young people being clustered together, and we get these really powerful youth cultures in the 50s and 60s and forward, right? From there you get, every generation sort of has its own really distinct youth culture with its own distinct kind of lexicon, right? With its own words. This is why I understand about half of the things that my children say to me at any given times. I can't remember. My daughter said something to me the other night, and I was like, what does that mean? She's like, it's all 8s. I'm like, Gen Z speak. I don't understand I think it's all good, but I don't know. But you get that, right? You get these separate kind of youth cultures that all listen to the same music. They all have the same kind of distinct lexicon. This emerges when you put young people all together. The other thing, obviously, at this point, right, we start to notice more things, and we make more distinctions, right? So all of these things start to happen as we create institutions geared towards children, right? We get children's clothing becoming the norm, right? Clothing that is different from adult clothing, right? That isn't just like a scaled down version. It's actually meant for them, right? You get the notion of things like play clothes, right? You see that like in the movie The Sound of Music. That's where I remember it from. But you get the notion, right, that there's clothes just for kids to play in, right? Different kinds of clothes for children. Children's language starts to differentiate as well, right? Or more specifically, maybe it starts to get cataloged, right? The children's language is different. And you start to get, okay, I guess I almost skipped one. We get books on pediatrics, right? When we start to think about kids, we start to think of them as separate medical entities, right? So we get the first books on pediatrics published sometime before the year 1600, right? So just before the 17th century. And then we get our first children's books published later in about 1744. And it's the first proper children's book that we have, like a product that's targeted specifically at middle-class parents to buy so that their children will have something to read, is this one, The History of Jack the Giant Killer, right? And that's the first, what we think of as the first children's book, right? And now, obviously, this has perpetuated into a whole genre, but it had to have its start somewhere, right? Okay. We start to get other things happening as well. We get the emergence of the modern nuclear family. Now, this one isn't necessarily principally driven by print. The nuclear family is probably more driven by industrialization. And specifically, a couple of things will drive it. One of them is obviously wealth, right? You get people that are wealthy enough to live, by themselves, away from extended family networks, but also urbanization. Oops. Right, so urbanization is critical here as well. You get people moving into cities, away from the towns, probably where their parents live, extended family networks, these farms where people had lived together for generations. All of that basically kind of falls apart with industrialization. And so you get the emergence of the modern nuclear family. Okay. With that, right, you get a couple of things. You get, the need for longer periods of schooling. Industrialization creates a lot of this, right? To function in an increasingly industrialized economy, you need to be educated, right? You need to be able to at least read and write and do some basic mathematics, right? Because you need to be a useful factory worker, someone who can take instructions in written form largely because that's what the economy demands. And parents, because they're now sort of the only caregivers for their kids, right? Because you've moved away from those extended family networks, they become, the principal educators of their children. Now, this, of course, is always going to be, it's always going to start in wealthier social classes, right? If you're poor in Europe, right, or in the United States where this is happening in parallel, this is going to take a long time to trickle down to you, right? You are going to not notice these things as quickly as people who are wealthy, right? But eventually it does trickle down to all of those social classes, right? And eventually you get this sense that parents are in the role of educator, or at least managing the education of their children, right? And it's presented as a moral imperative in Protestantism at first, and then a little bit later in Catholicism as well. Okay, now what do the middle class in England do, right? So England is kind of unique in that it industrializes first and it gets wealthy more quickly than its peer European powers, right? It gets much wealthier and much more powerful much faster. Now, the middle class in England largely uses a lot of their wealth to buy stuff. And amongst those things are larger segmented homes, right? So you go away from smaller homes where people live in kind of common spaces to houses that are much more segmented, right? Where there's private space. I don't know have any of you seen the Disney movie Peter Pan? Okay, right? So this is exactly what we end up seeing in Peter Pan, right? Right, so at the beginning of the film, Wendy, she's in the nursery with her brothers, right? And the precipitating sort of conflict of Peter Pan as a story is that Wendy is becoming a young woman and she is going to be moved out of the nursery, and she's having a hard time letting go of that. And Peter Pan's a whole metaphor on not being able to let go of childhood, right? And eventually Wendy does let go of her childhood. But the nursery is this space, right, where the kids are and the parents aren't, right? So it's a space where they're segmented, and the parents obviously have their own space. And if you've ever seen shows like, any adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, or if you've seen Downton Abbey, right, you kind of get this sense too of all these different spaces that people are in, right? The men go off to the smoking room, right, or the whiskey room to talk politics and economics away from the children and the women who shouldn't hear about such things, right, in that kind of time period, right? So you get this happening, right? The middle class uses its money to build these manor houses, to build bigger homes where they have more private space. And so you start to get this private-public kind of distinction, or this notion of private spaces where children are not. Okay, children, especially again in the middle and upper classes, become objects of conspicuous consumption, right? So people buy clothes and toys and books for their children, right? As disposable income increases, people are able to spend more on their children. They're able to keep them out of the adult world for longer, right? Middle and upper class people buy educators for their kids, right? Tutors for the boys and a governess for the girls. And they basically, will keep them being educated roughly until they go off and get married. Now, like I said, the middle class, can afford childhood relatively early, probably, as early as sort of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, right? So the late 1700s, let's say from the 1780s, and into the early 1800s. It's going to take a really long time for this to trickle down to lower classes, right? Okay. All right, we'll talk about private and public in a second here some more. So, adults, right? What happens is adults control that symbolic environment that young people live in, right? They control the information. And that transition from child to adult becomes a controlled one that's rolled out over time as you trickle out information to young people about the world that they live in. I take it that was just a stretch, not a question? Yeah. Okay, perfect. It looks like a stretch. Just want to check. Now for Postman, he thinks children evolve to become adults by acquiring the mind of a good reader. So he thinks, and this goes down to his particular kind of philosophy about technology, that basically technology sort of imposes its own logic on people. It's called media ecology. It's a school of thought that comes down from people like the Canadian thinker Marshall McLuhan. We don't need to worry about it, but it is its own interesting sort of branch of thought. But he thinks that, the technology, print, has its own kind of bias, and it imposes that bias on the people who use it. So people who learn to read become more individualistic, right? Why? Well, because print is sort of a thing that you do by yourself, right? It's less of a communal experience and more of an individual one, right? You sit down with that copy of whatever it is you're happening to read, and it's just you and the author in a sense. Logical and sequential thinking, right? Because books are hopefully logically organized, right? So you get that logical and sequential thinking that comes from the medium itself. The ability to abstract, right? If you read about, say, I don't know, if you pick up a copy of Harry Potter and you're reading about Hogwarts, right? You imagine what Hogwarts is like in your mind. You've never actually seen Hogwarts because Hogwarts isn't a real place, but you can imagine what Hogwarts is like, right? So if you pick up a copy of like Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, you've maybe never been to St. Petersburg, but you can imagine Raskolnikov walking through the streets of the city. Super curious if it spells, it did get Raskolnikov right. I'm really impressed with the subtitling. I'm very impressed. Okay. Delayed gratification, right? Because with a book, you kind of have to sit there and be patient, right? And you don't get that immediate kind of feedback, right? You're going to have to work your way towards the end of the story or the argument or whatever it is, right? You kind of have to not, I don't want to say gratify, that's a bad way of putting it, right? It takes discipline to do it. And learning becomes a intellectual and moral pursuit, right? It's something that's really important, an important thing that human beings have to do. And, it becomes, again, sort of, we'll talk about this more when we get to John Locke, it becomes shameful to not educate a child, right? To leave a child in ignorance is a shameful thing. And to be an ignorant adult is a shameful thing. You don't want to end up like the current president of the United States. You don't want to be ignorant. All right. So, other things that kind of come from, industrialization and print, we get this split between the public and private spheres, right? So public knowledge, what can be discussed anywhere around anyone, things that you can discuss in polite company, versus private knowledge, things that need to be kept secret from some. And now typically, right, the some are children and women, right, who aren't supposed to know about these things. That's why the men go off to a separate room to smoke cigars and drink whiskey and talk politics, right? And all of those fun things. Okay. And yeah, you get sort of let into those secrets when you are old enough, right? When adults deem that you have developed enough to know these things. And again, shame becomes really, really important because it becomes shameful to let kids know about things that they are not ready to know about. Okay. I know I mentioned this already, so we'll do this really quickly. Industrialization, right? You get this sort of split. You have your upper and middle class children who are children, and your lower class children, right? The working class and the poor who aren't, yet outside of that economic system. So you have a sort of bifurcation of children that you might say you have the children haves and the children have nots, right? And it takes a while for it to actually trickle down. Well into the 19th century, right? So well into the end, really, of the 19th century, right? When we get to kind of, beyond 1850, is when you really start to see, particularly the upper and middle class, starting to think, hey, well, my children are children, and those, poor and working class children, those look like children, but their experience is very, very different, right? And if you've ever read some kind of industrialization era, 19th century English literature, right? Someone like Charles Dickens and something like Oliver Twist, you'll recognize this kind of immediately, right? There are, the kids of the middle class who have a childhood. Those are the Elizabeth Bennets in Pride and Prejudice. And then you have the, the Oliver Twists, the orphans, and the poor who are working as chimney sweeps, working in mines, doing dangerous jobs all of the time, right? So this persists well into the 19th century and into really the beginning of the 20th century until you really get this starting to change fully, right? So again, a really, really long process of development, and it's uneven. It doesn't happen everywhere all at once. Okay. That's a really interesting question. Any of you guys have an American nuclear family reading or percept? One of the things that makes this really, really hard is largely the historical process that seems to happen is that encounter with the West really does transform other cultures, right? And a lot of these cultures, how to put this, they go through the same process as the West went through in hyperspeed, right? Because their process is so accelerated. And you could look at a case like, say, South Korea. If you look at South Korea, say in as late as the 1950s, right? South Korea is really a principally agrarian, mostly illiterate, underdeveloped economy. And, basically after the Korean War, so the Korean War ends in 1953, South Korea goes through this, basically the whole process that took the West 500 years, it goes through it in 50, right? So, but even less than that, like probably 30, 35, maybe 40 years, it goes from an agrarian to a highly industrialized society really, really, really quickly. And this happens in a lot of places, right? So a lot of cultures, I would say, don't get the time to kind of go through that really long process. Some of them get thrust right into industrialization without that adaptation time. And so I don't know that there's a universal answer, but I don't think it gets developed in the same way as it did in the West, because in a lot of cases, it's just like societies hit fast forward. You could look at China as well, right? China, after the communists take over, right, goes through a really rapid industrialization and urbanization that was primarily agrarian before. So a lot of this stuff ends up being kind of forced on people in ways that aren't as, say, slow and incremental as it was in the West. I hope that answers that question. It's a really good question. Okay, how are we doing for time? We're doing okay. All right. So, oh, bother. I don't know why that happens. And again, it's only on this laptop. My other one doesn't do that. Okay. Postman highlights a couple of really important thinkers and their ideas when it comes to childhood. And I think they're interesting in that each of them sort of shapes our understanding of childhood in really different ways. And the first one is John Locke, right? So John Locke, 18th century, like an Enlightenment British or English thinker, right? He's part of what I think we could rightfully call the English Enlightenment. I like to separate the English from the French Enlightenment, because the English Enlightenment ends in democracy and development, and the French Enlightenment ends in the revolution and people getting their heads cut off. So slightly different outcomes at the end of the day. The English did it better. That's all I'm going to say. Less decapitations in the English Enlightenment. His idea, right, and of course we always have to put things in Latin because it's fun, is that children are what he calls a tabula rasa, or a blank slate, right? That basically, when you emerge into the world, you are essentially unformed, right? And that basically it is then up to the adults in your life, your teachers, your parents, to write things upon you, right? And so it's bad or shameful to fail to write good things on it. And this, you get this idea, right, from Locke, really in very simplistic terms, that there are no bad kids. There are only bad parents and teachers, right? That somehow, if a kid ends up morally sort of degenerate or deformed or delinquent, that is the fault of the adults in that child's life, right? They have done bad. And from this, right, we're going to get lots of different things. I'll talk about it in a couple of slides, but we will get, in the 19th century, what ends up being called the child-saving movement, especially in the Anglosphere. Oops, I ran out of space. The child-saving movement, right, where people are like, oh, the poor must be failing to properly develop their children morally, so we'll do it for them, right? And it comes from this idea, right, that children are inherently sort of good, right? They're blank, and that if they somehow go bad, it's down to the adults that have failed to properly develop them, right? And for Locke, children need to be trained vigorously. Basically, it's up to adults to give them not only a rigorous kind of mental education, right, to teach you how to read, write, and do math, but also, physically as well. So if any of you struggled in gym class, you can thank good old John Locke for that, at least in part. And Locke, very practical guy in a lot of ways, thinks the best way to do this is to shame those who do badly and give credit to those who do well, which is basically where you get things like grades, right? A really simple system of being like, hey, A+ student, you must be good. C- student, you must be bad, right? So we get all of these things from John Locke, and many of them we carry with us to this day. Now, the 18th and 19th centuries are times where there's a lot of competing ideas. And one of those ideas competing with Locke, and in a lot of ways, objecting to that very English rationalist way of viewing things, comes from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, right? I just wanted to see how it would do the French. Okay, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Okay, now Rousseau is an interesting figure as well. He's a French thinker. He writes this very influential work on childhood called Émile ou de l'éducation, or Émile or on education, in which he kind of lays out his vision of children. And Rousseau comes from a school of thought called the Romantics. And here, Romantics doesn't have anything to do with, romance in that sense. It's more about nature, right? The Romantics are really convinced that one of the things that goes bad for humans is the overstructuring of them by society, particularly industrial society that forces them into boxes, right? And you see this in Rousseau's philosophy about children. Now, I always feel like I have to caveat Rousseau because for all of his passionate writing about children, Rousseau very much seemed to hate children. He fathered numerous children with numerous women and abandoned all of them. Had nothing to do with raising them whatsoever. And there's a very famous, it's probably an apocryphal, right? So it probably didn't happen, but a very famous story about Rousseau, where supposedly some rich French aristocrat came and is like, I read your book, Émile, and that is how I'm raising my children. To which Rousseau replied, "Are you crazy?" There's some, much of this is maybe a philosophical treatise rather than a practical one. Like I said, that's probably not a true story. It's probably something people made up about Rousseau later on. All right, now what's Rousseau's thinking, right, about children, despite the fact that he apparently hated his? Children, he thought, are good in and of themselves, right? So they're not good for what they will become. They're not good for their utility, right? Children are just an unadulterated good, right? They're just good in that they exist, right? So that's a nice thought. His other thought, right, is that children's emotional and psychological needs, this is the romantic part, approach the state of nature, right? And that state of nature is something that civilization tends to tamp down. So we should want to kind of, how to put this, foster those natural human tendencies. And what are young people, right? Young people have a lot of dynamism, energy, a lot of passion, a lot of joy, and we should want to kind of harness that and encourage that, right? So, anytime you hear people like talking about young people and saying, we need to follow their passion, right? The young are wiser than we are, right? They know things that we've forgotten. And you kind of hear this, here and there. You're essentially hearing a sort of cultural echo of Rousseau, right? That somehow they're closest to the state of nature and that their natural passions and enthusiasm isn't, that they're inexperienced and naive. It's actually that they're closer to what it means to be human than adults who've been sort of beaten down by industrial society, right? All right, and this one, that people need to be lovingly cultivated, right? Basically, Rousseau's sense, this is as much drawing as I could possibly do, in Rousseau's sense, children are like a flower, right? That's a flower. And what we should want to do with that flower is not to cultivate it, not to change it in any way, but just to fertilize it and make its natural tendencies come out, right? And again, we see a lot of this in kind of modern parenting philosophy, right? Your parents probably spent a good deal of time trying to figure out what you were interested in, what your passion was, so that they could put you in violin lessons or hockey and then drive you around God's green earth. Basically fostering that interest at great expense to themselves so that you could find your kind of authentic self. I say this as a parent whose daughter landed on equestrianism and horses as her passion, something that will probably lead to my inevitable demise. as I attempt to buy a horse somehow. Anyone have a solid horse for cheap? Um, like really good but really cheap horse? I'd appreciate tips. She really loves horses. I'm also deathly allergic to them. Like if I get within like 20 feet of them, my eyes swell up. This is a perfectly good match in our family. Anyway, right? A lot of fostering of interest, right? Cultivating her. We're fertilizing her natural interests, right? And this is a lot of what adults think of children as, or what we should do with children, right? Is not mold them into what we want them to be, right? So they're not an end, they're not a future human. Oh dear God. How long do I have here? Well, we'll do our best. What part can I unplug? All right, hang on. Did I even bring my charger? I don't know if I did. Oh. Huzzah. We will survive. My computer live streaming this for hours does not like me. All right, I have to kill the mic. Hang on. I know. Bear with me. Okay. I don't know if I can make these subtitles work. Can you hear me, computer? Huh. Hey, it works. Okay, there, I fixed it. Okay. Whew. Close call. What was I saying? Right, Rousseau. Good times. Right, so as opposed to wanting to kind of form our kids, right, write good things on that blank slate, Rousseau is like, no, the good things are already there. We just have to bring them out by fertilizing them. Again, you see that lots in kind of modern parenting philosophy. All right, Freud. Let's do Freud quickly. I hate Freud. So we all should. Right. Children have a sexuality, right? So they have the same inherent drives as adults, right? And what is it? Well, they want to sleep with their parents. Oh, good times. Um, you know, children have instincts and psychic drives, um, and those must be controlled and formed, right? And again, I don't want to spend too much time on Freud. He writes this all in a book called Civilization and Its Discontents. And again, for Freud, all of these things are sort of natural to human beings. And what we do to kids by forcing them to sublimate their base desires essentially screws them up, right? You kind of force them into patterns that are not natural for humans, which is where, Freud thinks all psychological disorders come from, right? It's by, I don't know about the Oedipus complex, what that comes from. But other things, right? Like by taking away our natural impulses and sublimating them, we essentially sort of damage children in some way. We have to civilize them, but it hurts them at the same time. All right. And now a much more, shall we say, civilized person. John Dewey. And again, if you've ever been over and taken classes in education, Dewey's philosophy remains pretty influential, at least at its core. And basically, all it is, in kind of simple terms for Postman, is that children's needs have to be addressed in the present, right? You can't always be thinking about children's futures. In a sense, they are a means to an end, right? We want, fully formed adults, but they're also an end in and of themselves, right? That we want happy children as well, and we need to address their needs in the present. So like I said, much of modern educational philosophy is basically, this idea from Dewey, how do we meet the needs of children today with a future orientation, right? Because we want them to be, functioning adults, but that sometimes means we have to also address their needs in the present. Okay, buy a horse in Mexico. That sounds like a terrible terrible idea. Maybe it's a great idea. I will look into that. But how do I get it back? I don't know. So many logistics questions. Gas is really expensive right now, too. The furthest I ever made it to was Colorado, and that felt really far. Okay. Will I drive down to Mexico to buy a horse for my daughter? I don't know. Trevor is trying and then child in Sunday. Oh, I haven't almost always. I don't have a lot on Indigenous youth and childhood in this particular course. It's well outside my area of expertise. I'm much more of a technology guy. What I will say, and here I'll go back a couple of slides because I do think it's worth mentioning, and I forgot. And here let me take this off. One of the, if you want to think about like dark sides of this idea, right? Of the idea of the tabula rasa, right? The idea of the blank slate. A lot of European philosophy about children and childhood, largely, comes down to this idea. And if you want to see where this kind of played out in tragic ways, right? We can think of my pen suddenly stopping to write. I'm being censored by my pen. Okay, let's just say residential schools. I don't know why it's probably it lost its connection or its battery died. Let's charge it up for a sec. Residential schools, right? Residential schools, in a large part, are a function of things like an idea of children as a blank slate, right? If you can sort of get to them before, their culture imprints on them, you could largely, in this theory, make them into good British or Canadian citizens. And that's largely what happened when it comes to Indigenous youth through the 19th and 20th centuries, right? It was this idea of they're a blank slate. Well, let's imprint on that blank slate before their Indigenous parents and cultures can, and then we'll make them properly British. But yeah, unfortunately, I will say, well, in terms of Indigenous kind of youth studies, well outside my area of expertise in this particular case. Okay, let's continue to go. There are really interesting things. I was just reading some stuff about particular efforts at like cultural reclamation amongst Indigenous youth. It's not my area of expertise. I do think it's interesting, where you see big improvements in social outcomes by pretty simple interventions in terms of teaching language, reinvigorating cultural traditions. I've even seen one, it was a program in BC all around rowing, right? Like rowing canoes and doing this as a team of Indigenous people. And that had seen pretty good results in terms of connecting people back to culture and improving a whole bunch of measures of social engagement and pro-social activity. But again, not my area of expertise. Just a dabble in it. Okay. All right. Couple more slides. I think I just got 2 more slides here. And then switch topics or just stop for the day. I'll let you decide. Okay. So Postman his book basically covers roughly from 1440 to 1800. And I'll just say a few words about what happens afterwards. So one of the things that happens sometime towards the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, is we start to kind of, people discover adolescence, right, as a social phase, right? This one, it's hard for me to imagine, right? Because I'm like, haven't we always known there's something weird going on? Not weird, natural, but something going on, in young people like 12 to like 17, right? That they're undergoing all of these physical changes. But no one really talked about it, and no one had assigned it a word until sometime around the end of the 19th century. One of my favorite, like, just random bits of trivia, is that the word teenager doesn't appear in the English language until 1957, where it appears in an article in the New York Times. And then it gets picked up, and now obviously it's a widely used term. But I think it's really, really interesting, right? To think about, we didn't think of, adolescence as being a thing until the end of the 19th century, right? And you get this, what's generally referred to as the Victorian era in England, where suddenly, questions of things like sexual development become paramount, right? Especially for boys. And amongst the things that they do, especially in the middle and upper classes to their boys, is they're like, oh no, they're developing sexually. We want them to develop properly. We should probably send them off to boarding schools, right? If we send them off to boarding schools, we'll keep them away from girls, right? And then there will be no little harlots to, tempt them. And then they will have a better form and more, I say this as a joke, better form sexuality to kind of riff on poor Victorians, right? So they sent their boys off to boarding schools, right? And girls largely going to stay home and get educated by a governess, tutor. Yeah, we get somewhere around the end of the 19th century, the idea of puberty coming in as a way of sort of understanding and acknowledging the emergence of sexuality in young people, which again, I always think is just fundamentally so late, and so recent. It seems such a natural idea to us, that it seems so strange to me to think that it happened so recently. Okay. I mean, weirdly, one of the funny things that happens at these boarding schools is, when they're sent off and there are no girls around, they start having sex with each other, which is always kind of funny because the Victorians were also really prudish about homosexuality. And then, they send boys off, and basically, I don't want to say they made them gay, but they certainly created an environment where that behavior was more prevalent. So that's super fun for Victorians. Okay, so the 19th century, what else is happening? Well, in those growing industrial cities, you get the growth of a lot of crime and problems involving young people, right? We don't have really great official statistics from this period. What we have mostly is anecdotal and journalistic accounts of young people running amok. But what happens, right, as you get lots of people moving to these cities, parents, both mothers and fathers that are working all day, kids are sort of left to roam the streets. In a lot of cases, they get into trouble and they start committing crimes. Now, in a lot of cases, this will have an ethnic character, especially in the United States, right? And these youth gangs eventually evolve, into things like the Irish and Italian mafias, right? They sort of find their formation in these ethnic enclaves and in people committing crimes and getting in trouble. Largely because those young people, have really poor prospects for jobs and wages, right? The industrial period is one of really poor working conditions and wages. And so often they turn to crime as an alternative. Now, what ends up happening is there's a kind of a weird cultural reaction to this. Like I said, we call it they call themselves actually the child saving movement, where sort of rich and middle class, typically British white Protestants, basically look at all of the problems that are happening in the lower classes, and far from putting it down to economics, they're like, oh, the parents of these children must be bad. They must be bad parents. Largely, a lot of these groups are Catholic. So these Protestants are like, oh, these Catholics don't know how to raise their children. And so what they do is they start to lobby for sort of for a bunch of things. One, they start to lobby for child labor laws, right? So they see kids working and they're like, oh, those children, they are like our children, but poorer and dirtier. But they shouldn't be working. So the child saving movement is instrumental in bringing in child labor laws in the latter half of the 19th century. But they also lobby for a bunch of other institutions, things like public education, right? To get these kids off the street and teach them proper values away from their parents, a child welfare system, to take children who are being neglected away from parents, and eventually, right, an orphanage system run by the state, and eventually that will morph into a foster care system run by the state. and a youth criminal justice system. And, we really don't get the emergence of a youth criminal justice system or youth courts or youth prisons until the latter half of the 19th century. We get sort of youth prisons, reformatory schools, industrial schools before we actually get youth courts, right? We don't see youth courts. I think the first one is in Chicago in 1898. But there's been kind of like institutions for delinquent youth or juvenile delinquents, as they're called at the time, into the end, or sorry, into the middle of the 19th century, right? So around 1850 through 1890, we're seeing them emerge in places like Canada, the US, Germany, and France. Okay, I think that's my last slide. Okay, we got 9 minutes. It's probably not worth starting a new topic with 9 minutes, unless you really want to. Didn't think so. All right, why don't we leave it there? We'll talk about generations. We'll pick up talking about our silence, our boomers, and all of that on Wednesday.